September 17, 2006, Manhattan. Patricia Kennedy Lawford dies at 82 of pneumonia in her apartment. Within hours, the Associated Press publishes her obituary under the headline, "Patricia Lawford, JFK's sister, dies." 6 words. 5 of them belong to someone else. The lead sentence calls her the sister of President Kennedy, whose marriage to Peter Lawford lent Hollywood glamour to her family's political dynasty. Her education at Rosemont College, her work as an NBC production assistant, her decades of institutional work for the arts and for addiction recovery, all compressed into afterthoughts, beneath the only 2 facts the public was apparently expected to care about: whose sister she was, and whose wife she'd been. That obituary echoed a pattern in which coverage often centered the Kennedy brothers, while the sisters were comparatively less visible. The brothers became the main story. The women were more often treated as background. And the distance between what Pat and Jean Kennedy actually did with their lives and how they were described to the American public is the gap where this story lives. Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. and Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy had 9 children. The boys, Joe Jr., Jack, Bobby, Ted, were raised with a single gravitational purpose: political power. Joe Sr. expected his eldest son, Joe Jr., to reach the presidency. When Joe Jr. was killed piloting an explosives-laden bomber in August 1944, that expectation transferred to Jack. When Jack was assassinated in 1963, it landed on Bobby. When Bobby was shot in 1968, it fell to Ted. The ambition passed from son to son like an inheritance deed, each brother carrying the weight of the brothers who came before. The girls, Rosemary, Kathleen, Eunice, Patricia, Jean, were raised in the same household, sat at the same dinner table, breathed the same competitive air. But the family story made different kinds of room for them. Jean Kennedy Smith, the youngest daughter, put it plainly in her 2016 memoir, The 9 of Us. Describing those family dinners where Joseph Sr. grilled his children on current events, she wrote, "Joe and Jack devoured every morsel. They dove in with theories, solutions, remedies, and platforms. We all listened, of course. We all listened. The boys theorized, the girls absorbed. Nobody issued a formal decree banning the daughters from ambition. The structure was subtler than that. In a family where the dinner table functioned like a rehearsal stage for politics, Jean's memoir suggests the boys dominated those discussions, and it followed the Kennedy women out of the dining room and into the press, where it hardened into something more permanent, a public record that consistently treated the brothers as subjects and the sisters as supporting cast. Patricia Helen Kennedy was born on May 6, 1924, in Brookline, Massachusetts, the 6th of 9 children, delivered at 51 Abbotsford Road, the family's second home in the neighborhood. Rose Kennedy kept detailed health records for each child on index cards, purchased from a local stationer, tracking vaccinations, symptoms, weight, and diet. Pat's card noted chickenpox, scarlet fever, measles, and whooping cough, all before the age of 10. She studied at the Sacred Heart Convent School at Roehampton in London, while her father served as ambassador to Great Britain from 1938 to 1940. Then attended Maplehurst Sacred Heart Convent School in Bronxville, New York. In 1945, she earned a bachelor's degree from Rosemont College, where she didn't just attend theatrical productions, she directed and acted in them, building a portfolio in performance and production that pointed toward a career in media. After graduation, Pat took a job as a production assistant in NBC's New York department. She also worked for Kate Smith's radio program and with Father Peyton's Family Theater. She didn't enter formal politics. She worked on campaigns instead. During John's 1946 congressional race in Massachusetts' 11th District, Pat and her sisters and mother held Kennedy Teas across Boston, social events in private homes and function halls, where they discussed their brother's war record and personal qualities to potential female voters. The teas were so effective that in 1952, when Jack ran for the Senate against incumbent Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., Lodge himself conceded their impact. He said he lost the election due to those damn tea parties. Pat campaigned for Jack's presidential run in 1960, traveling around the country speaking on his behalf. She'd later work Robert's and Ted's campaigns, too. The Los Angeles Times described her during Jack's earliest race as someone who joined her sisters to work in their brother's campaign office during the day and accompany him on political errands at night. 3 brothers, years of campaign labor, and when Pat's own life was summarized for the public, the campaigns she ran weren't the story. The story was always the brothers she ran them for. On April 23, 1954, Pat married Peter Lawford, an English-born actor with a career stretching from MGM musicals like Easter Parade and Royal Wedding to the Rat Pack circle around Frank Sinatra. A crowd of 3,000 spectators gathered outside St. Thomas More Roman Catholic Church in New York to see the couple emerge. They settled in Santa Monica, California, and had 4 children: Christopher in 1955, Sydney in 1956, Victoria in 1958, and Robin in 1961. The Lawford home in Malibu became a crossroads for politicians and entertainers: Sinatra, Judy Garland, Henry Fonda, Milton Berle. Christopher Lawford later wrote that his mother thought of Marilyn Monroe as her little sister. The marriage positioned Pat at the intersection of 2 power systems, Kennedy politics and Hollywood celebrity, and the press treated her primarily as a bridge between them. The Gale obituary reference described her as having a front-row seat to an era of glamour and tragedy in America, linking the Kennedy administration and Hollywood through her marriage to the actor Peter Lawford. A front-row seat. A spectator at someone else's show, not a woman who'd worked in television before she turned 23. The Lawford marriage was troubled and heavily covered. Variety's retrospective acknowledged it bluntly. The marriage of the Lawfords, despite 4 children, was a sad story, the subject for constant coverage. Several secondary accounts cite Lawford's drinking and extramarital affairs as factors, though the underlying primary record is uneven. What is documented is the outcome. Pat and Peter separated in the mid-1960s, and the divorce was finalized. Sources conflict on whether it was 1965 or 1966, with even the JFK Library and Wikipedia disagreeing on the year. Pat was the first Kennedy of her generation to divorce, a significant breach in a staunchly Catholic family. She never remarried. After the divorce, Pat moved her family back to New York. She founded the National Committee for the Literary Arts, creating author lecture series and scholarships. She worked on museum exhibits for the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum, serving as an original director of the JFK Library Corporation in 1964. She engaged with the National Center on Addiction and Substance Abuse at Columbia University. The National Park Service's biographical feature noted that Pat's own struggle with drug and alcohol abuse motivated her to get involved with the National Center on Addiction, though primary documentation of her personal addiction history remains thin, and the claim rests largely on biographer Lawrence Leamer's reporting and her son Christopher's memoirs, rather than institutional medical records. Leamer, author of The Kennedy Women, offered the most direct published characterization. He said Patricia Lawford was driven to alcoholism by her failed marriage and her brother's death in 1963. He added, "She was the gentlest, the sweetest of all the Kennedy sisters, and she suffered the most from the assassination of her brother. Christopher Lawford, in his best-selling memoir Symptoms of Withdrawal, wrote that his mother's lightheartedness and vibrancy made her my grandfather's favorite. But he also said she felt resentment toward her father at not being allowed fully to live up to her potential. A daughter who worked in television in her early 20s, who spent decades building cultural institutions, and who understood, even while it was happening, that the family narrative had smaller plans for her. A full, complicated, productive life. And when the final line was drawn, the AP headline still read, "Patricia Lawford, JFK's sister, dies." The NPS, to its credit, eventually published a standalone feature titled Patricia Kennedy Lawford, A Life of Inspiration and Service. It opened with an explicit acknowledgement. Although often overshadowed by her more public-facing siblings, such as Jack, Eunice, Bobby, Jean, and Ted, Patricia Kennedy Lawford shined her own bright light onto the world that shouldn't be forgotten. Even that correction began by naming the 5 siblings who outshone her. Jean Ann Kennedy was born on February 20th, 1928 in Boston, the 8th of 9 children, the youngest daughter. Her mother once said of her, "She was born so late that she only was able to enjoy the tragedies and not the triumphs." It's a devastating summary. Rose meant it as a comment on timing. Jean was too young to remember the early ascent. But it reads like an epitaph for a woman who would bury 4 siblings, survive a husband's infidelity, endure her son's rape trial on national television, and still have to wait until she was 65 for anyone to describe her as a political figure in her own right. Jean attended Manhattanville College, where she majored in English and befriended 2 women who would become her sisters-in-law, Ethel Skakel, who married Bobby in 1950, and Joan Bennett, who married Ted in 1958. She graduated in 1949 and in 1956 married Stephen Edward Smith, a businessman from a wealthy New York family, in the Lady Chapel of St. Patrick's Cathedral. Hundreds of spectators waited outside. They had 2 biological sons, Stephen Jr. and William, and later adopted 2 daughters, Amanda and Kim. Stephen Smith became the Kennedy family's financial advisor and chief political strategist. Ted Kennedy once said of him, "For 34 years, from the day he married Jean, Steve was like a brother in our family. He was the wisest advisor, the most skillful campaign manager, and the best friend that any of us ever had." The New York Times called him the man to see and be seen with in New York. Jean, by contrast, maintained what was described as a lower profile than other members of the extended family, a relative term in a dynasty that treated discretion and visibility as interchangeable currencies. Jean was present at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles on June 5, 1968, the night Bobby was assassinated. She and Stephen were in the room. That fact appears in biographical timelines. It does not typically appear in the narrative accounts of that night, which center on Bobby, Ethel, and the broader political drama. Jean witnessed her brother's murder at close range, and then returned to the margins of the story. Her organizational career ran deep, but quiet. In 1964, she became a trustee of the Joseph P. Kennedy Jr. Foundation. In 1974, she founded Very Special Arts, later known as VSA, now part of the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts, an international nonprofit providing arts and education programming for people with disabilities. By 2011, VSA's programs reportedly served some 276,000 students in 43 states and 52 countries. Jean traveled extensively on VSA's behalf, advocating worldwide for greater inclusion in the arts. For nearly 2 decades, between founding VSA in 1974 and her ambassadorial appointment in 1993, Jean did this work with almost no mainstream press attention. She appeared in Kennedy family photographs. She attended funerals. She was listed in group references to the Kennedy siblings. But she wasn't profiled, not interviewed at length, not treated as a figure with an independent public identity. The record from those years is institutional. Trustee listings, foundation reports, program expansions, not journalistic. The press covered the Kennedy brothers in real time. Jean's work was cataloged in archives. In April 1991, Jean's son, William Kennedy Smith, was accused of raping a 29-year-old woman. William was acquitted. In that moment, public attention fixed on Jean mainly as a Kennedy mother. Her 3 decades of institutional work went largely unmentioned in the coverage. She existed, in the public eye, as an appendage of family crisis. 2 years later, in 1993, President Bill Clinton appointed Jean U.S. Ambassador to Ireland. She was 65. The New York Times would later note that she was the first Kennedy woman of her generation to take on a serious political job. That sentence, published in her 2020 obituary, quietly concedes the entire pattern. 65 years old before anyone in the press described a Kennedy daughter's work as serious politics. As ambassador, Jean threw herself into the Northern Ireland peace process with a forcefulness that surprised the diplomatic establishment and antagonized parts of it. In January 1994, she helped persuade Clinton to grant a U.S. visa to Sinn Féin leader Gerry Adams, a decision opposed by Great Britain, which considered Adams a terrorist due to his links to the Irish Republican Army. A 1994 New York Times dispatch from Dublin reported, "When Jean Kennedy Smith became the American ambassador here 13 months ago, she was reasonably sure that given the adulation the Irish have for the Kennedy family, she would be warmly welcomed." The dispatch's framing assumed her appointment was primarily symbolic, a famous name in a friendly country. She made it operational. Ted Kennedy, in his memoir True Compass, described his sister's conviction. Jean was convinced that Adams no longer believed that continuing the armed struggle was the way to achieve the IRA's objective of a united Ireland. He added that it took only a couple of hours' conversation with Jean to discover what was the most important thing on her mind, the opportunity for a breakthrough in the Northern Ireland stalemate. Adams's ensuing trip to the United States helped lead to an IRA ceasefire in August 1994. RTE later reported that Jean put her trust in the instincts of Father Reed. Together they played a critical role in delivering the provost. The Good Friday Agreement followed in April 1998. Jean retired as ambassador that July. The Irish government conferred honorary citizenship on her in recognition of her service. Taoiseach Bertie Ahern told her directly, "You have helped bring about a better life for everyone throughout Ireland." The ambassadorship also revealed a woman willing to fight institutional resistance. In March 1996, Secretary of State Warren Christopher reprimanded Jean for retaliating against 2 Foreign Service officers who had disagreed with her stance on the Adams visa and sent a formal dissent cable. The Foreign Service Journal called the State Department's report on the matter scathingly critical. She also faced scrutiny over embassy refurbishment expenditures and settled a conflict of interest allegation with a $5,000 civil payment in 2000. The record shows a complicated diplomat, not a ceremonial appointment who happened to share a surname with a dead president. In 2011, President Barack Obama awarded Jean the Presidential Medal of Freedom for her work with VSA and with people with disabilities. She published her memoir. She was inducted into the Irish America Hall of Fame. Columbia University's School of Professional Studies memorialized her with a formal tribute. And when Ted Kennedy died on August 25, 2009, ABC News ran a profile of Jean under the headline, "The Last Kennedy, Jean Kennedy Smith." A woman with a 35-year organizational career, a major diplomatic appointment, a Medal of Freedom, and a role in one of the century's most significant peace agreements, reduced to a position in a family succession chart. The youngest daughter, the one left standing. Jean died on June 17, 2020, at 92. The New York Times headline foregrounded her Ireland work. Jean Kennedy Smith dies at 92, helped forge peace in Northern Ireland. The Guardian identified her as someone who played key role in Northern Ireland's peace process in the 1990s as U.S. envoy. These obituaries were markedly better than the ones Pat received 14 years earlier. They named accomplishments. They credited agency. But the Times also carried that revealing line: the first Kennedy woman of her generation to take on a serious political job, as though this were simply an interesting biographical fact and not an indictment of everything that came before. One powerful source of that mythology had a specific origin. On November 22, 1963, John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. 1 week later, his widow Jacqueline called Theodore White, the journalist who had written the best-selling Making of the President 1960, and summoned him to Hyannisport. She was furious at political pundits who were already publishing cold assessments of her husband's administration. She wanted White to write something for Life magazine that would fix how JFK would be remembered. During hours of conversation, Jackie returned again and again to a single image: the Broadway musical Camelot, which she and Jack had listened to on their Victrola. She fixated on the closing lyric: "Don't let it be forgot that once there was a spot for one brief shining moment that was known as Camelot." She concluded, "There'll be great presidents again, but there'll never be another Camelot again." White later admitted he allowed himself to become her instrument in labeling the myth. The Life essay cost $30,000 an hour to hold the presses for. Jackie reviewed and edited the text before it ran, crossing out some of White's words and adding her own in the margins. She hovered near the kitchen telephone as he dictated revisions to his editors, insisting the Camelot references stay intact, even when the editors wanted to tone them down. The resulting piece, For President Kennedy, an epilogue, fixed the metaphor permanently. White himself eventually acknowledged the tension in the story it told. The epitaph on the Kennedy administration became, in his words, Camelot, a magic moment in American history when gallant men danced with beautiful women, when great deeds were done, when artists, writers, and poets met at the White House, and the barbarians beyond the walls were held back. In White's phrasing, women are framed more as atmosphere than as actors. Gallant men danced. Beautiful women were danced with. Great deeds were done by men. Once that framing calcified into national mythology, the Kennedy sisters fit awkwardly inside the story Camelot was telling. The Nation later described the Kennedy-era press dynamic as marked by the myth of Camelot and the dangers of sycophantic consensus journalism. A Harvard thesis on media coverage of Edward Kennedy was subtitled, "A Case Study of Journalistic Behavior." The scholarship points consistently to a mid-century press corps that was deferential to the Kennedy family in ways that went far beyond normal political access, a culture where cocktails with the president substituted for critical scrutiny. Arthur Schlesinger, the historian and Kennedy insider, was baffled by the Camelot framing. "Jack Kennedy never spoke of Camelot," he said. Another Kennedy hand was blunter. "If Jack Kennedy heard this stuff about Camelot, he would have vomited." The mythology was Jackie's invention, White's vehicle, and the press's adoption. Its staying power came from a grieving nation's willingness to accept a symbolic narrative over a complicated one. And it helped shape how family members, whose lives were too complicated, too ordinary, or too female to fit inside the legend, were remembered. The Kennedy family had already demonstrated a capacity for active narrative management with Rosemary, the eldest daughter. Born September 13, 1918, Rosemary exhibited developmental differences from an early age. The National Park Service's assessment is blunt. For many years, the American public knew little about the eldest Kennedy daughter, Rosemary. A Sage Journal article described the family's response as attempts to cope with and obfuscate her condition. In 1941, Joseph Kennedy Sr. arranged a lobotomy for 23-year-old Rosemary, without telling his wife until after the procedure was completed. The surgery was catastrophic. The instrument Dr. James Watts used, according to Ronald Kessler's biography, Sins of the Father, looked like a butter knife. As Watts cut, Dr. Walter Freeman asked Rosemary to recite the Lord's Prayer. When she became incoherent, they stopped. She lost most of her ability to walk and speak. She was institutionalized at St. Coletta School in Jefferson, Wisconsin, where she lived in a private cottage the family built about a mile from the main campus. Her mother didn't visit for 20 years. Her father never visited at all. Her siblings didn't learn what had happened or where she was until 1961, when Joseph Sr. suffered a debilitating stroke. The family's public explanation for Rosemary's absence, offered when Jack was running for re-election to the Senate in 1958, was that she was reclusive. Her condition was first addressed publicly by her sister Eunice in a 1962 Saturday Evening Post interview, but the lobotomy itself didn't become public knowledge until 1987, when historian Doris Kearns Goodwin revealed it in The Fitzgeralds and the Kennedys, 46 years after the surgery. Bertram S. Brown, director of the National Institute of Mental Health and a former aide to President Kennedy, told Kessler that Joe Kennedy described Rosemary as mentally retarded rather than mentally ill, in order to protect John's reputation for a presidential run, and that the family's lack of support for mental illness is part of a lifelong family denial of what was really so. Rosemary's story is the strongest documented case of deliberate concealment among the Kennedy daughters. No comparable evidence exists proving that Pat and Jean were hidden by a formal family strategy. The distinction matters. Rosemary was actively erased. Pat and Jean were structurally diminished, less by conspiracy than by a mythology that had no use for them. The pattern of selective visibility among the Kennedy women reinforces this reading. Eunice Kennedy Shriver achieved significant public recognition, but her visibility was channeled through a specific role: disability advocacy inspired by Rosemary's life. The Special Olympics, which Eunice founded in 1968, gave her a socially legible philanthropic mission that aligned with, rather than complicated, the family narrative. She was visible because her visibility served a redemptive purpose. Rosemary herself eventually became a public figure, but only as a tragic symbol, an origin story for Kennedy generosity, rather than an indictment of Kennedy control. Pat's life, media career, Hollywood marriage, messy divorce, reported struggles with addiction, quiet arts patronage, didn't lend itself to hagiography. Jean's life, institutional work, behind-the-scenes family management, late career diplomacy, was substantive but lacked a dramatic arc Camelot required. Neither sister could be turned into a symbol that served the myth. Mid-century expectations for women in wealthy Catholic political families reinforce this dynamic. Historical research on women in American politics confirms that throughout this period, public political visibility was structurally harder for women. The Gilder Lehrman Institute notes that, at the beginning of the 20th century, women were outsiders to the formal structures of political life, voting, serving on juries, holding elective office. Even as opportunities expanded, Women were seldom elected to positions of political power, according to the Women's History Organization. The House History Office documents that more young women pursued careers in male-dominated fields during this period, loosening their traditional bonds to home and family. But loosening isn't breaking, and political dynasties were among the last institutions to loosen at all. The Kennedy sisters' relative invisibility wasn't invented in a boardroom. It grew from the same soil that produced every other political dynasty of the era. A culture where the daughters campaigned and the sons governed, where the wives attended and the husbands decided. The Kennedys were an extreme example of a common pattern, amplified by extraordinary wealth, a self-conscious mythology, and a press corps that treated access to the family as a professional credential. Tracking what happened to Pat and Jean against the major Kennedy milestones makes the pattern visible as a chronology rather than an abstraction. In 1946, Pat helped organize teas that won Jack his congressional seat. The coverage named Jack. In 1952, Pat's teas helped defeat Lodge. The coverage named Lodge's complaint. In 1954, Pat married Peter Lawford. The coverage named Hollywood. In 1960, Pat traveled the country for the presidential campaign. The coverage named Jackie as the campaign's defining woman. In November 1963, Jack was assassinated, and Camelot rewrote the family story around the brothers and the widow. In the mid-1960s, Pat divorced. The coverage, where it existed, named Peter Lawford and the Rat Pack. In 1968, Bobby was shot at the Ambassador Hotel with Jean standing in the room. The coverage named Bobby and Ethel. In 1974, Jean founded VSA. No major profile followed. In 1991, Jean's son William stood trial for rape. The coverage named Jean as a Kennedy mother. Only in 1993, when Jean became ambassador, did any major outlet treat a Kennedy sister as a primary political actor, and even then, the initial framing was ceremonial rather than substantive, the famous name in a friendly country. At every juncture, the sisters' presence was documented in archives, but absorbed into someone else's story in the press. The JFK Library now maintains biographical pages for both Pat and Jean. The Kennedy family collection, approximately 6,000 photographs, scrapbooks, and albums donated by Rose Kennedy, has been fully digitized and made accessible online. Archivists cataloged each photograph, creating detailed descriptions to maximize findability. The material documents 100 years of family life, from 1878 through 1980. The collection exists, the record is there. But a record in an archive and a story in the public mind are different things. Pat's JFK Library page lists her education, her media career, her campaign work, her founding of the National Committee for the Literary Arts. It's thorough. What people actually read in September 2006 was the AP Wire. The sister of President Kennedy, whose marriage to Peter Lawford lent Hollywood glamour to her family's political dynasty. Jean's record is richer still. Ambassador, Medal of Freedom recipient, VSA founder, Peace Process participant, author. And in 2009, ABC's framing was The Last Kennedy. A position in a family tree, not a person with a career. Rose Kennedy, giving a tour of the Brookline family home in 1969, spent most of her time talking about Jack. She described the bassinet, the nursery, the books he loved. King Arthur and his knights was a favorite, she said. She described holding her baby for the first time. When you hold your baby in your arms the first time, and you think of all the things you can say and do to influence him, it's a tremendous responsibility. Him. The child she individuated. The child who became president. Her descriptions of the other children were collective. When the children were ready for bed, they would come to the living room and play for a little while. The children, not their names. The distinction between those who were individuated in the family story and those who remained part of the group was audible even in an informal house tour given 6 years after her son's death. Senator Edward Kennedy's tribute to Pat after her death, inadvertently the same reflex. "My sister Pat is irreplaceable," he said. Throughout her life, Pat was constantly inspiring and helping others. Whether it was campaigning for her brothers or championing literacy and the arts, her purest gift.